Hi, this is Roger. Thanks for dropping by. First of all, change of plans. Friday should be Project Orchids Day. I've got 2 left to do, Orchid number 7 and Orchid number 8. I'm not going to do that video today, I'm going to miss a week. There are still 2 more Fridays in May, just the way the calendar works. So we'll pick up again with Orchid number 7 next Friday, when basically I'll have the time to do it. This has just not been a good week for me allocating time, not good at all. But it will soon be over, so then I'll be back to some sort of normality. Right, so that's that. This is also going to be the introduction to my talk, so I will stick this on the front of my talk before I post it. Now, just to explain the talk, on the day, which is tomorrow, believe it or not, will be silent, and I'll narrate it as I present it, basically, so I'll talk along with the video. However, putting the silent version on YouTube wouldn't serve a lot of purpose, would it? So I haven't done it yet, but this is the next thing I want to do. I'll record a soundtrack along the lines of what I will say on the day, you know, under the various clips and pictures and text boxes and things, to make it into a YouTube video. And then that will follow this introduction. The idea being that you can enjoy it for what it is, fine, but it would be nice if some of you gave it a thorough look. I mean, obviously I can't do major structural changes or change pictures or anything like that, but there's quite a lot of text that appears in it. It would be nice if people could proofread that to make sure the sentences actually make sense, I've used the right words and spelt them correctly. You can't spell check a video. And then whatever comments I get along those lines, I'll have time just about to edit that video tomorrow morning and recreate the master to go on the laptop to go to the Orchid Society. Let's see if I don't run around in circles and disappear up my own proverbial. So that's the idea. So as I said, the talk will be silent when it's done, but for YouTube purposes it will have a soundtrack, and it's coming up now. This is the bit where I introduce myself, so I won't bother doing that here. Get straight on into where the presentation itself starts. Okay, this is an interesting story. Why did I choose Dendrobiums? I didn't. They chose me. It was purely circumstantial, because when I started expanding my collection and, you know, converted my grow room in conservatory into a grow room, I was looking for decent sized plants to buy, and there was a guy in the Netherlands that was selling really good sized Dendrobiums at reasonable prices and very, very cheap postage, and his plants just stood out, so I bought them. So, like I said, it wasn't the fact that they were Dendrobiums I bought them, it was because they were good sized plants. I mean, some of the plants I got off of him were heading up towards specimen sized plants. And, you know, this is a long time ago now, long before Brexit, obviously. And with the advent of Brexit, I lost access to all the places that I was getting my plants from. So my, you know, collection as far as Dendrobiums is concerned is almost ground to a halt now. I'm sort of dealing with the ones I've got and the change of environment, which is done some of them in. I have had some losses, and in the current environment with Brexit they are virtually irreplaceable. So something we all have to consider now in the UK. Your orchids are precious, especially your species, because getting them again if you lose one is not going to be easy. Anyway, so having got a good few Dendrobiums and a collection going, they then swung me round to actually thinking, I do like these a lot. I like the variety, I like the colours, I like the different shaped plants, the different ways they grow. There was a lot of interest in the genus for me, and so I've stayed with it, and I've still got more Dendrobiums than any other type of orchid, and that will probably remain unless I lose any more. Anyway, enough talking about me. Let's have a look at some orchids. Now, these are all plants that I've either had or still have. So these were once or are my plants. Frosty Dawn, a nice black hair type hybrid. Lots of versions of that as well. And then we've got this one, Hancockii, grows like an untidy bamboo bush, but it's worth it for the blooms. They're absolutely gorgeous. Last a long time too. Glomeratum, one of the cluster types, grows little clusters of blooms, one of the larger ones as well, that one. And then we've got Nestor, that's a Parishii cross. Really strong fragrance of raspberries. Unfortunately, the blooms don't last long. Bullenium, another cluster type, grows little clusters, changes colour. It opens one colour and within a week is totally different colour. Got Chapayense. Once I had this and I would love to get it again, but it's almost impossible. I don't know anybody that's got one. Senili, Mr. Hairy on my YouTube channel because it is covered in white hairs and it's a black hair type. We'll talk about that later. A Phyllum, one of the winter resting long cane deciduous Dendrobiums. A lot of people don't like that because they spend the time without leaves. My only awarded plant, an RHS award for this one, hence it's called Hannah. Right, Rhodostictum, the plainest of all of the Latoria type blooms, but its simplicity is why I like it. This is just to include a Phalaenopsis type, a hybrid, no ID. Lovely clean white with a hint of green. All colours you can get of those. Still one of my favourite Dendrobiums, Hercoglossum. Those blooms glow in the sun, in bright light, gorgeous. Then we get on to the more interesting, another Latoria type, Alexandrae. Unusual colours and shape, but if you want unusual, you have to go for this one. I'm sure that's not from this planet. That's come from somewhere else. Right, some details then. As a genus, it's one of the largest. And depending on where you look, well over 1,500 species. One document I looked at said 1,800 plus. So it depends. And the number of hybrids, countless. They're divided into sections. There's around 20 sections, depending again on where you actually look. And we'll have a look at the 6 most popular. So where do they come from then? Now you've got some work to do. This is important. That map of that area has got green on it in places. You need to picture where that green is for what's coming next. I tried to superimpose pictures on top of each other and I couldn't do it, so you're going to have to do it in your mind's eye. Anyway, if you look at the areas where the Dendrobiums come from, foothills of Himalayas in India, across southern China, you've got Myanmar, Vietnam, Thailand, Laos, the Philippines, Indonesia, down through northern Australia, Queensland, and there's even one from New Zealand. Now bring that picture back and map it onto those dark colours, and you can see that where the Dendrobiums come from is where the most rainfall is. Now do it again. It's also where it's warmest. So you're looking at warmth with a lot of rain. Okay, habitats then in these areas that we've looked at. You've got the tropical rainforests, semi-deciduous forests, deciduous forests, cloud forests, open scrubland, from sea level up to high elevations right up to the edge of the tree line. So that covers most types of environment. Now think back to the map and think back to that area. What is special about this area? And it's basically the fact that it is this. The seasons they get are just wet and dry. They don't really have our 4 seasons. But some of those areas do have a longer transition between wet and dry. Could we call that spring and autumn? Not really, but worth a thought. Okay, so most dendrobiums are epiphytic, they grow on trees. Some are lithophytic and can grow on rocks. There are even a few terrestrials, one of which we'll look at later. Their structures tend to be referred to as canes rather than pseudobulbs. So, you know, they've got a finger in every pie there. So, pause for thought. Why? Have a think about what we've just covered. The habitats, the part of the world they come from, the type of weather that you'd expect to see in those places, type of temperatures you'd expect to see in those places. And don't forget, temperature drops the higher you go. So you've also got cool. It's not only hot and steamy. Yeah? So now let's have a look at what we started to do, the seasons for the dendrobiums. So these are the 6 sections I'm going to look at. The Phalaenopsis, the Spatulata, the Dendrobium section in the Dendrobium species, genus, Calista, Latoria and Formosae. I won't be covering every species in these sections. In some of them I've got 30 plus. I'm just going to pick on some of the more popular ones. So I'm going to start with the Phalaenopsis, endearingly known as the Phalaenopsis types. Species that you could come across, the most popular will be Bigibum, or Biggie Bum as I like to call it, Affini, Dicufum and Williamsianum. And Affini and Dicufum are often thought of as synonyms for the same species. Some disagree. Okay, Dendrobium bigibum is the emblem of Queensland. It's their national flower. Comes from semi-arid and warm conditions. So the summers are up in the low 30s or sometimes higher, and winters are 18 degrees C plus. So you need warmth if you're going to attempt to keep that, but you don't need high humidity. Affini, this is a highlight, warm, loving orchid. Notice highlight and warm. Moist, comes from swamps, lagoons. Now you can see why using the section as a care guide doesn't work. The first 2 we've looked at don't come from the same sort of places, so they would need different care. Okay, right, these Phalaenopsis type hybrids have been turned into a real thriving business in Taiwan and Thailand. Hundreds of thousands of hybrids of all different colours specifically bred to grow long spikes with nice numbers of blooms, and they're for the cut flower trade. So they just keep them blooming over and over again and go round, cut the flowers and sell them on. It's a big business. So, you know, hybrids have their purpose. Right, seasonal care for these then. Generally speaking, it's the temperature that dictates how you need to look after them. If you can keep 18 plus permanently for your low winters and a good 3 or 4 degrees warmer during your daylight hours, then these have not got a season. They will grow continuously throughout the year, and they'll push up new growths at any time, providing you can maintain that heat. The difference is they will have periods when they're not growing, where you would still need to reduce the water down, otherwise the roots can still rot even with that heat. So yeah, these are very easy going and very suited, especially the hybrids, for growing in the home, where those temperatures should be reasonably easy to maintain. Well, prior to the energy crisis anyway. So there we go, these are easy. Okay, the next section, Spatulata. These are endearingly known as the Antelope types because of the shape of the blooms. Some examples: Antenatum, Discolor, Johannes and Statiotes. I have trouble saying that every time. There's something a little unusual about most of these plants in this section. I wouldn't say avoid them, but we'll get there. So if we look at Antenatum, you can now see with the blooms there, the antelope type bit sticking up. Humid and warm, highlight all year round, and look at those temperatures. Highlight all year round. They are very difficult to bloom in the UK. They almost need direct sun in the UK to bloom. They are very large and vigorous. Talking of large and vigorous,
This colour, again, humid and warm, high light all year. Yeah, look at the temperatures. This plant is classed as large and vigorous and can grow to more than 4 metres tall. Some documents say 5 metres plus. Is your ceiling that high? You need to think about these before you go into them. Right then, some general care for these then. The thing that's most important to remember is the heat and the humidity and the light. And the combination of those three do not make these very suitable for growing in the home. You won't have enough light in the home. Even in a window you probably wouldn't have enough. These really do need high light to get them to bloom well. Some of the spikes on these are 2 metres long. So I wouldn't say avoid this the species in this section, because there are some that are smaller growers, but they all tend to like that hot, humid atmosphere, you know, so you need to think about that. And the majority of them do need that really intense highlight. This is higher light than Vanderlight, I would suggest. As good as it gets in the UK, and it still might not be good enough. So that's those. Right, so the Dendrobium section in the Dendrobium genus still makes me giggle. It's split into two groups because there is a subtle difference in the care required for the two groups. So group 1, I've got in here Friedrichianum, Wardianum and the Nobile. Nobile the species, forget the hybrids in this presentation, we're dealing with species. So the Nobile, it will take heat in the growing season. Medium light, doesn't need bright light to grow. In the winter you need to drop this temperature right down, 40 to 50 degrees C. And the brightest light you can give it, no feed and very little water. And that's where a lot of people come unstuck and it won't bloom unless you can provide those circumstances. Friedrichianum is not quite so fussy, it's more temperature tolerant. It tends to be found quite high up in trees, so it needs brighter light in the growing season as well as that bright light in the winter. It doesn't really have a rest, but it does tend to stop growing in winter, so you would naturally reduce the water as you would for all orchids that are not in growth. Right then, some general care. The Nobile species is not ideal for trying to grow in the home or even in some grow spaces because you can't get that cooler temperature. But the hybrids are really good for growing in the home because you don't need anywhere near such a drop in temperature, and some will even bloom without the drop in temperature, so they're less fussy. They've been bred to be less fussy. Some of the others in this group, though, they do need that chill down, some more than others. So you need to go down to the individual plants and check them out. Check out those winter temperatures and see if you can actually find somewhere that's bright and that cool. And if you can, then they may well be worth having a go. Most don't have long-lived blooms, but some of the Nobile hybrids that you could be growing in your home last an awful lot longer than the species does. That applies to a lot of hybrids really. That is part of the requirement often. Bigger blooms, brighter colours, longer lasting. Usually at the sacrifice of fragrance. Still, can't have everything. Right then, group 2. Examples in here are Anosmum, Moniliform. The Japanese have made a whole culture around that orchid with loads of different named varieties, most of which you can't pronounce. Lodigesii and Phalaenopsis. Those are the ones I've picked on. Now, the difference in the group is that they don't need so cool a temperature in the winter. It's as simple as that. But it is a subtle difference. So, you know, reasonable temperatures and medium light to grow it in the growing season. It needs a winter rest, Anosmum, but not so cool as group 1. But again, you know, get that temperature drop difference between the growing season and the rest season. Cut that water and cut the feed out completely. Moniliform prefers to grow cooler all year round. This will put up with some heat, but it tends to slow it down in what would normally be its growing season. Again, it doesn't need bright light, not to grow anyway. It doesn't really have a winter rest, it just likes to be a bit cooler with less water. So it's more of a subtle rest, that's why it's in group 2. not such a dramatic thing. Now, Lodigessii prefers to grow cooler as well. Again, medium light to grow it, and it's often found on the ground in humid, mossy areas. And it grows canes that arch over, and then grow kikis that grow canes that arch over, and it forms a mat. And it can end up covering quite a large area if it's on the ground. It doesn't tend to do it so much in trees. Findlayanum, again, it prefers to grow cool, doesn't need highlight again. It needs the normal winter rest treatment for most of the winter until about 3 weeks before the end, and then it's got to be harsh. It's got to drop right down in temperature, increase the light, and cut the water out completely for that period at the end of winter. So it's a bit special, that one. So again, you can use the section care as a guide, but you've really got to get down to the individual species and find out what that species needs, because it will often be subtly different to another species in the same section and the same group. But nonetheless, these tend to be winter resting types, or not necessarily a full rest, but reduced water and not much feed at all. The reason being that a lot of them just stop growing. They do their growing in the growing season, that's where it gets its name from, and then come our autumn, they just slow down to a standstill, and you go along with it rather than forcing it. Go along with it. Look at your plant. Is your plant slowing down yet? Because if it isn't, don't force it. If it wants to keep growing, then you keep going with it until it decides it's finished for the season. And hopefully you've got some nice full-size canes. So yeah, seasonal care for these, winter resting types to one degree or another. But be careful. Right, on to section Calista. Examples in here: Lindleyi, most people still use the synonym aggregatum. Chrysotoxum, little story about that. Farmeri and Jenkinsii, and I've picked on some of these because I've got them, and in one case have had rather than got. So what's special about these then? These are quite temperature tolerant. Lindley is temperature tolerant, and it only needs medium light to grow it, so far so good. But it does need a winter rest, and it does need bright light, and it does need to be cooler. So it is a winter resting type. Now mine didn't get a very good rest one winter and it didn't bloom, but it did the next one when I rested it. So there we go. Chrysotoxum, again temperature tolerant, medium to bright light though. This likes more light than some of the others, and it produces many spikes per cane, and they're fragrant. And I had an absolute monster and I got rid of it. It went to Lynn, who I got it from, so it went full circle, and I presume Lynn still got it. It was a good plant. Right, Farmeri, warmer grower this time round, grows high in trees, so obviously, it likes to be shadier even though it's higher in trees. So I think it sort of tends to hover around under the canopy. It needs a short rest, and it's colour variable. There's a pink form and a yellow form, so that it is variable. Lovely blooms though. Jenkinsii, like a mini version of Lindleyi, but they are separate species. Again, temperature tolerant to grow it well, but it does need that drier, cool winter rest and the brightest light you can give it. And it's another one of those, just cooling it down won't do it. If you can't whack that light up, chances are you won't get many blooms, if any. So that's the general care for these. These are, why they're in the same group is that they grow pendulous spikes with many flowers, and that depends on the plant. Farmeri really chucks out a lot of blooms and quite a lot of spikes together. Lindleyi does as well. Jenkinsii, not so many blooms per spike, but it has the same type of function. Yeah, so same sort of principle in the way it blooms. And we'll do something a bit special with Lindleyi and Jenkinsii a bit later in the presentation. Right, so care for these. Not a true resting type, but Lindleyi and Jenkinsii certainly won't bloom if they don't cool down, but it's the light that does it. I've noticed that you can still get these to bloom without a big drop in temperature, providing you've got a much bigger difference in the light. So keeping them shadier in the growing season and then increase the light for the winter will often do it without too much of a drop in temperature. But all of them prefer that drop in temperature and the brighter light for their winter semi-rest, I'll call it. Right then, on to the Latorias. The examples I've chosen here are Aberrans, Alexandrae, Rhodostictum and Spectabile. 3 of which I've got, 1 I had. So practical knowledge here, rather than just looking it up. I wouldn't do such a thing, would I? Of course I wouldn't. Much. Right, Aberrans then. This one's temperature tolerant, so it's classed as cool to warm growing, strange expression. But it tends to grow in shady, mossy forests, so it's got good humidity all the time. But it needs to be kept a bit drier when it's not in growth. Again, that's accommodating the drier season from where it comes. So relatively easy to look after, that one. Alexandrae. Now this is a cool grower. Yeah, so you can see again where the section care is not necessarily a good idea. Needs good light but not too bright, and it needs to be evenly moist. But keep it a bit drier when it's not in growth. Now that's not really a seasonal requirement, it's a plant requirement, because it could be growing any time. Rhodostictum, again temperature tolerant, but this comes from lower montane forests, and it's often found as a terrestrial on mossy slopes where it's never dry. So our first actual terrestrial in the true sense. Yeah? So bear that in mind when you're deciding to put it on a mount. Right, Spectabile. Now this is a warm to hot grower. So you can see that the section description is not good. This needs good light, again, but not too bright. This comes from coastal rainforests and doodah swamps. Mangroves, I'll get there in a minute. But it does still need to be drier in winter, but it's always warm. So there we go then. So seasonal care for these is at plant level. You can't do a generalisation with these. We've got a cool grower, a warm grower, one that needs brighter light, one that grows, you know, sort of shady, one grows on mossy slopes, you know. Is that slope under trees or not? I couldn't find out. Because if it was out in the open, that would be bright light, wouldn't it? So you need to get down to individual level here. But the one thing that's common to most Latoria types is they don't like to get cold. Unless it's a species that specifically says it's a cooler grower, then assume they like to stay warm. And as some of them are warm to hot growers, you know, make sure you know what you're getting before you bring it home or order it online. Yeah, because they do vary an awful lot. But some of the most spectacular looking blooms in amongst here, you know, that Spectabile is it's definitely an alien plant. It's not of this world. It came off Doctor Who or something like that. It's an alien species. Stunning to see in real life though. Okay, on to the Formosae. Black hair types, but I'm afraid I refuse to use the word that is associated with that. I'm quite happy to just call them black hair types. It works for me. So I've chosen Formosum, Infundibulum, or Infundibulum, Senili and Trigonopus. Again, 3 of those I've got. So Formosum then. It's generally a cooler grower, but it can take some heat with care. And it needs high light and high humidity all the time, and if you're going to give it heat then it's going to need even higher humidity. No rest as such, but drier in winter, but it needs cool nights in the winter, and it's fussy. I've lost a couple of those. Infundibulum, however, is an easygoing one. It's temperature tolerant, tends to grow mainly in deciduous trees. That gives you a clue on its light levels and its requirement. Yeah. But it's classed as intermediate, but it does need a drier rest, but not necessarily cool. Don't let this one get too cold. It's not happy. Right, Senili, the old man orchid, because it's covered in silvery grey hairs, just like me. Shady in summer, but drier and brighter in winter, and the roots should never get soggy. I've had 3 of these and lost all 3 of them. They do well for a couple of years and then they just fail, and I've yet to find out why. If you find out, let me know. Right, Trigonopus. Again, I had this a long time ago and lost it very quickly. I don't think it was a good plant. I now have another one from Trey. They're temperature tolerant, they need good to bright light, and they're classed as intermediate, but they'll go either side of that. Drier rest but not cool. They are classed as difficult to keep going over a long period of time. I'll let you know. So general care for these can't be done. You've got those that like to be shady in summer but bright in winter, some that like to be relatively bright all the time, some that grow cooler, some that grow warmer, and one in particular that we've gone over that needs a dramatic difference in its winter temperatures. Yeah, so it needs to be really cold winter nights but not cold days. And that's an unusual, it's geared up to where it comes from. It's an unusual environment. So you've got to get down to the individual plant level, look it up, find out what sort of environment it lives in, what sort of temperature range, and does it need any special winter treatment. You can't generalise for these, but they are well worth growing. You know, certainly things like Infundibulum and Formosum have got absolutely stunning blooms. They're 4 or 5 inches across, and they last for ages and ages. You know, 2-3 months. And absolute pristine white with a lovely vibrant colour in the lip. So they're well worth growing for that alone. They don't tend to have a lot of blooms, but I have seen one with 6 or 7, you know. So there you go. Okay, now I'm going to show some video clips. I mean, my main medium, because of my YouTube channel, is videos, and so far we haven't had any video clips. So you're now going to see something that you probably won't have seen anywhere else, and probably never will. It's a direct comparison between 2 relatively similar Dendrobiums, but highlighting the differences. So this was filmed some time ago, and it was basically a request from a viewer. Can you compare Lindleyi and Jenkinsii for me? Yeah? So I've got both, so I thought we'll get them out and put them alongside each other and we'll do a direct comparison. Yeah? So if you look at the 2 plants, one is obviously smaller. The Jenkinsii has much smaller canes and they like to lie flat. You notice as they grow away from the mount, they turn over and lie flat against it. So they do like that lie flat mechanism. Yeah, that's how they grow. So that's a distinct difference because the Lindleyi tends to grow away from the mount. So, okay, it does run alongside in places, but it does tend to grow away and is obviously an awful lot larger. I've even got a cane with two leaves. Now that is unusual. They're normally just single-leaved canes, as is Jenkinsii. So there you go, a direct comparison. Now Jenkinsii has beautiful blooms, but it doesn't have many per spike. So it's you know, if you can get a mass blooming on one of these, they look stunning, but they often only produce a few spikes. Lindleyi, however, has much longer spikes with very many blooms on. Both are fragrant, but you've got to get close. They don't stink the room out, so to speak. So Lindleyi, much more blooms per spike. So if you don't get so many, it's not so bad. Yeah, so they both need the same treatment. And the winter rest for these, if you don't get it right, you will either get none or very few blooms. And okay, the winter rest, in your head you're thinking, oh, it needs to be cooler. Well, yes, that is part of it. But the most important part with these 2 is a dramatic increase in light from the light they had in the growing season. There's your trick. If you keep these quite shady during the growing season, they'll grow perfectly well. They'll have darker coloured leaves, but they'll grow well. And they'll get nice big canes and they'll be nice strong plants. Then when you take them into their winter rest, you reduce that feed down to nothing and the water down to very little, but you bump that light up. I mean, I used to keep mine facing the sun through bare glass to get that bright light, and it did the trick. I did get a couple of mass bloomings. So there you go, direct comparison between two similar Dendrobiums. You won't see that anywhere else, that's for sure. Right, so we've gone from a comparison to now an unusual bloom. And this comes up as one of my quite favourite Dendrobiums because of the bloom. It's unusual in as much as it's frilly. But it's not just a little bit frilly, it's a lot frilly. And it's got the same frills on the lip as it has on the petals. It's unusual. It's a lovely colour, nice sort of daffodil type yellow, and the centre of the lip is almost green but not quite. It's a greeny tinged yellow. Now again, as this comes into Calista, so you know, long spikes with many blooms on. This particular plant at this particular time had spikes coming out all over the place. Now there's a story there, because I firmly believe that this plant actually bloomed itself to death. Because as you can see, that's quite a healthy looking plant. It's quite good. It's got good leaves. There's no sort of coloration on the leaves or anything. They're a good colour. Spikes coming out all over the place. And it continued to bloom like that for 9 months. 9 consecutive months where it was never out of bloom. Just one spike after another, with lots of blooms per spike. Now that spike dangling down to the right hand side there's only got 2 buds on it. Some idiot broke it. Otherwise it would have had a lot more. But yeah, I firmly believe that this plant exhausted itself because it suddenly stopped blooming and collapsed. It actually died within a very short period of time. Leaves started to drop and eventually it just died. And I never really found out why. And I just put it down to total exhaustion. But then it did it to itself. The only thing I can think of is that either the conditions were just so good that it just kept blooming because everything seemed fine, or the conditions weren't quite right and it was desperately trying to perpetuate the species by continuously blooming when it didn't really have the strength to do so. And there's an unusual thing as well. Roots coming out of the base of a flower spike. Now some Dendrobiums just do that. Nobiles have a habit of doing that. Some Phalaenopsis hybrids will have a habit of doing that. Anyway, so an unusual bloom. Right, now we'll have a look at one that's got an unusual growth habit. And I haven't got any other Dendrobiums that grow like this. So I class this as unusual. It might just be how I grow it, but this is Dendrobium hercoglossum. It tends to have blooms that start with a trickle and then they expand into a mass blooming, and then there's like the tail end where there's a few extra blooms sort of later in the year. At this point of filming I was desperately trying to catch some blooms with the light behind them where they look their best. They start to glow and the camera never captures it properly. It's also out of focus, oh thanks. It's the only clip I could find with the whole plant in it. Anyway, why is this unusual then? It starts its new growths mainly in the spring, but also continues producing new growths on through the summer. Those growths extend, fully leaved, and they carry on growing, although a little bit slower, right through the winter. So they come out the other end of winter. I just did some photo edits to catch those blooms. Yeah, so they come out the end of winter, still growing, albeit slowly. Now they speed up, but they carry on growing through their second season. And they start to extend, gain the length, and start to arch over during that second season prior to becoming totally pendulous. Those were the new growths at the top of the plant. So what happens then? Well, they come into what would be their second winter. Have they finished growing? No. Many of those canes will still carry on growing again relatively slowly through that second winter and come out the other end into their third season. during which they normally dump their leaves, or at least a lot of them, if not all of them. So they eventually do become deciduous. When do they bloom? They very rarely bloom in the spring following their initiation. So when they start to grow, the following spring they don't bloom. But then they bloom for the next 2 or 3 years. So that's sometimes on partially leaved canes and some on fully deciduous canes. Unusual growth. So there we go. We've got 2 basic seasons where the Dendrobiums come from, a wet season and a dry season. In that wet season it tends to be warm, humid, and there's an awful lot of rain. In the drier season, I'll call it, rather than dry, it's cooler, it's brighter, and there's a lot less rain. And remember that in that wet season is the longest day lengths, and in the dry season you've got the shorter day lengths. Nowhere near as long and short as our seasons though. Then there's the habitats to apply on top of that. You've got the evergreen tropical rainforests, very sort of dense, very shady near the base, bright near the tops of the trees, and shafts of light coming down through the canopy in places, but basically shady. Then you've got the deciduous and semi-deciduous rainforests. So they're still humid, there's still a fair old bit of rain, but obviously there's an awful lot more light underneath the trees when those trees have lost their leaves if they're deciduous. So you've got more light coming in here. And then you've got the mist forests, the cloud forests, where the sun very rarely penetrates, and you've got a heavy canopy due to the moist atmosphere. So most things that grow in there have to be deemed shady, and they're cooler. That is that habitat. So there we go. And you must have gleaned by now from the information that you really have got to get down to the individual species and find out its needs, because they vary so much and it's a vast genus, so you can't do a generalisation. So now the hard bit for me. Any questions?
Okay, and just for the YouTube version, just to say thanks for any help you can offer with spelling and things like that. And this will stay on YouTube. You know, I mean, it can be looked at and viewed forever. It can stay there. There's no reason not to. I mean, I just don't want to do any more talks like this. There's too much effort, too much stress. I don't even get paid for it. I do it, you know, for the society, to save them paying for an outside person to come in, which can cost quite a lot of money nowadays. So, but I don't think I'll do any more big ones like this. It's just been too stressful. The problem was it combined with other things. That was the problem. Anyway, thanks for your help. Any that you can offer, gratefully received. And won't be a video tomorrow, Saturday, for obvious reasons. I'll be away. So I'll be back on Sunday, and to forewarn you, the Sunday genus will be Cymbidiums, and we will have a chat about looking after Cymbidiums to the best of my ability. I've only recently got Cymbidiums in. I can't say I've got years of experience because I haven't. But I've been mixing with an awful lot of people that have for quite a long time. So we'll do what we can on Sunday. And see you then. Thanks for dropping by.